At the age of 14, I felt completely alone after my parents dropped me off at my grandma's house, essentially abandoning me because of my medical issues. They perceived me as different, a freak, and could no longer deal with the challenges I presented. Now, they are coming back into my life, asking for my inheritance to help my brother out of a tough situation. For background, I was diagnosed with epilepsy when I was quite young. This diagnosis came with a lot of challenges, not just for me but for my family as well. My parents, unfortunately, were not equipped to handle the emotional and mental strain of my condition. As a result, they began to treat me as if I were some sort of burden. I remember being around 6 years old when I first noticed the stark difference in how they treated me compared to my brother. He was 3 years older than I was and seemed to be favored, perhaps because he didn't have the same struggles that I did. As if epilepsy wasn't enough to contend with, I was also diagnosed with dyslexia and severe ADHD at the age of 8. This only added to their frustration. It would have been one thing if my parents had been understanding and patient, showing appreciation for the unique challenges I faced. However, they had chosen to become parents and should have been prepared for the various hurdles that could arise. They seemed to believe that since my brother was healthy and thriving, I would follow suit without any issues. When I turned out to need more support, they seemed ill-prepared to face that reality. The atmosphere at home was suffocating. I often felt more like an outsider than a member of the family. It was as if I bore the weight of my illnesses, and my parents' reactions to my struggles created a sense of shame and isolation within me. I recall many occasions where my very presence seemed to drain the energy from the room. Conversations would stop, and the dynamic would shift simply because I walked in. Even as a child, I sensed that I was viewed as a liability instead of a loved one. As I grew older, the emotional strain only intensified. My mental health deteriorated under the pressure of feeling unwanted. I started to act out in my teenage years. Adolescent hormones mixed with years of feeling rejected overwhelmed me. I stopped caring about my studies and began purposely failing my classes, driven by anger and resentment toward my parents. My disobedience escalated, and I became rude to friends and family alike. Even though I recognized that pushing people away was not healthy, I felt compelled to do it as a call for attention, yet, even then, my parents remained largely indifferent. Every time my school called regarding my behavior, my parents would come, sighing, showing disappointment without offering any guidance or discipline. Their lack of concern fueled my frustration. I wanted them to notice me, to care enough to engage, but instead, they often ignored my cries for help. Tantrums turned into an attempt to get their attention, but it rarely worked. They would dismiss my feelings, sometimes referring to my outbursts as fits, and telling me to just be normal. Such remarks only added to my heartbreak. Then, when I was 14, I crossed a line at school and broke a major rule by bringing a pack of cigarettes. It was a desperate act, born from years of feeling like I didn't belong, a misguided attempt to push the boundaries even further to see if it would finally evoke a response from my parents. I made a reckless choice one day that turned my life upside down. I decided to take a pack of cigarettes to school, feeling bold and a little rebellious. In the middle of class, I lit one up and started smoking right there, not caring about the rules or the consequences. My teacher, understandably shocked and angry, immediately asked me to stop and demanded that I leave the classroom. In a moment of defiance and anger, I flipped him off, letting my frustration show. That action was a tipping point for me. I had a history of being a troublemaker in school, but my parents had always managed to shield me from the worst consequences by explaining to others that I was different and had some challenges that set me apart from my peers. However, this time was different. After smoking in class and my disrespectful gesture toward my teacher, I found myself expelled. This was a defining moment because it was the first time my parents were genuinely furious with me. They confronted me with a fury I had never experienced before. Their words stung deeply, and the things they said to me are imprinted in my memory forever. They expressed regret about having me, saying that if they had known I would turn out to be such a troubled child, they would have chosen to terminate the pregnancy. They called me a burden to the family and mentioned how life was better when they only had my brother. They made it clear that they wanted me to leave our home and never return. As punishment, I was grounded for a week, and during that time, my parents kept me locked in my room. The isolation was unbearable. I had no freedom to leave my space except for bathroom breaks, and even my meals were handed to me through the door. It felt like I was in solitary confinement, and the pain was intensified by the fact that it was my own family treating me this way. I struggled to understand why my actions, which I viewed as merely acting out, warranted such severe punishment. I felt they had neglected to give me the attention and support I truly needed as a child, and I believed they bore some responsibility for my behavior. I recognized that I wasn't easy to handle, given my struggles, but I wished they had thought more carefully about their decision to have me in the first place. After a week of this harsh treatment, I finally understood what they meant when they said I would never be welcome back. One day, out of nowhere, my parents told me to gather my belongings and get in the car. My mom and brother packed everything for me while I waited outside. Eventually, we began driving, and it soon became clear we were headed to my grandmother's house, my dad's mom. Initially, I thought they might be taking me there for a brief stay, perhaps hoping that the strict discipline of my grandma could help me get my life together. I felt a glimmer of hope, knowing that she had a soft spot for me and usually treated me better than my parents. However, upon arriving at my grandmother's house, the reality set in. My parents were not leaving me there temporarily, they were abandoning me at my grandmother's, effectively handing over the responsibility of raising me. They had decided they no longer wanted me in their lives. The week of silence had been spent convincing my grandmother that I needed to stay with her. When we reached her house, my parents unloaded all my things and left them at the front door, instructing me to bring everything inside. They told me that this would be my new home from now on and that they didn't want any further contact with me, particularly after my recent actions. They believed I was trying to tarnish their reputation, and this was a line I had crossed that couldn't be undone. Standing there, I tried to plead with them not to do this. Despite everything that had happened, I still craved a relationship with my parents. I felt an overwhelming sense of desperation and sadness. I was just a 14-year-old who wanted to be loved and accepted, even amidst the chaos of my behavior. At the age of 14, I found myself in a tough situation. I desperately wanted to feel like I belonged in my family, but instead, I faced the heartbreaking reality of being sent to live with my grandmother. This was a difficult truth to accept, and it weighed heavily on me. The thought of being left at my grandma's house made me anxious. I couldn't help but worry whether she would be able to take care of me. At over 60 years old, I knew she was getting older and possibly less capable of managing the challenges that came with looking after a teenager like me. Despite knowing that my grandmother loved me, I was unsure about how she really felt about taking me in. I felt like I was merely shifting from being a burden to my parents to becoming a burden to my grandma. I wanted to please her and not let her down because I remembered how disappointed she would be during my visits when she learned about my struggles at home and school. Yet, she always encouraged me, reminding me that she believed in my potential. She would urge me to behave better, suggesting that my parents might eventually come around if I made an effort. This encouragement was bittersweet because I feared that if I moved in with her, she might also start resenting me like my parents had. The thought of losing her support was terrifying, as I could not bear the idea of being alone and unloved. I tried pleading with my parents to reconsider their decision, but they firmly stated their intentions right in front of me. They told my grandmother that they were done with me and had no desire to deal with my so-called freakish behavior. Hearing them use language that bullies at school often used against me cut deep. It hit harder coming from my own parents, who I had always hoped would understand and accept me. Recognizing that my parents' harsh words were a reality I could no longer ignore was painful. The realization that they were, in fact, the most significant bullies in my life forced me to accept that this arrangement with my grandmother was perhaps a blessing in disguise. I figured that if they had never truly loved me, it didn't matter how well I behaved, they would still choose to focus on my brother, who they deemed normal. With this understanding, I finally ceased my begging and came to terms with the fact that I would be living with my grandma. I made a resolution within myself to improve. I believed I deserved better, and so did she. I was determined not to let my parents' indifference ruin my life. Once my parents left, my grandmother and I had a much-needed heart-to-heart discussion. She was honest with me, explaining that although she cared for me deeply, she had hesitated to take me in due to her concerns. She shared that my father had informed her of my troubles and that at her age, handling a difficult teenager was a daunting task. She admitted she had been slow to come to a decision because she worried whether she could create the right environment for my growth. That was why it had taken her a week to accept me. However, after hearing that my father had been keeping me locked in my room for that entire week, she began to realize that he might not be the right person to raise me. She expressed regret for not stepping in sooner, acknowledging that she had her own challenges to manage as a widow with limited resources. Yet, now realizing the extent of my struggles, she understood the reasons behind my behavior. Grandma expressed her wish for a fresh start with me. Unlike my parents, she wanted to do right by me. She encouraged me to see this transition as an opportunity for both of us to build a new life together. She told me that I should see this situation as an opportunity, and that's exactly what I chose to do. I took a moment to apologize to her for everything I had done in the past that might have hurt her, acknowledging the pain I caused. In return, I expressed my feelings about how she hadn't intervened earlier in my life, despite knowing how poorly my parents treated me. I told her that I forgave her for not adopting me sooner and for allowing me to endure those difficult years with my parents. From that point on, we agreed to leave the past behind us and work together towards a better future. I will always be grateful to my grandmother for her support and kindness because I genuinely believe that without her, I wouldn't have become the person I am today. She played a crucial role in my life, and my journey took a positive turn the day I moved in with her. Alongside her guidance, I made a firm decision to improve myself in every aspect of my life. My grandmother was committed to helping me succeed. She created a nurturing environment that allowed me to thrive. She arranged for the right tutors to assist me with my studies and enrolled me in a private school, ensuring that everyone understood my specific needs. Unlike my parents, who saw my challenges as weaknesses, she viewed them as reasons to provide me with the extra support and resources I required. Thanks to her efforts, I was able to graduate with excellent grades and pursue higher education just like any other student. I accomplished a great deal during this time, and I owe it all to my grandmother. My parents continued to visit her from time to time, but they never made any effort to reach out to me. Whenever they came around, I made it a point to avoid them, leaving the house until I was sure they had departed. They didn't seem to mind my absence, nor did I. This pattern continued for a couple of years until my grandmother confronted them about their neglectful parenting. She told them they were terrible parents for not even trying to talk to me, especially since I was doing so much better. They had every reason to reach out and apologize for their past mistakes, but instead, they refused to acknowledge any wrongdoing, insisting that they had raised me perfectly. They labeled me as a bad kid, calling me names such as rotten apple and freak. My grandmother was outraged and demanded that they never return. From that moment on, they did not visit again. Their stubbornness blinded them to the truth about their parenting. They couldn't face the reality that they had failed me during my early years, and instead of recognizing my growth, they continued to dismiss it. For nearly 10 years, communication between my grandma and me and my parents ceased entirely. We acted as though they didn't exist in our lives. In that time, I achieved many milestones and celebrated personal victories, but our relationship remained severed. My parents never reached out, even though I had social media where they could have contacted me. I never blocked them, they simply chose not to connect with me. It was only after my grandmother passed away a few months ago that they decided to reach out. Losing her was incredibly painful because she was the one person who consistently had my back, no matter what. Even though I had moved out for college and started building my life after graduation, she remained my foundation and support system. Life has felt very different without her presence, and I was still grappling with my grief when my parents came to my door. Shockingly, it had not even been 6 months since her passing, but they were already demanding that I share my inheritance with them. They claimed that my brother, who they described as normal and healthy, was struggling more than they anticipated and that he needed my help to clean up the mess he had created. When they visited a few days ago, my brother was notably absent. A few days ago, some visitors came to see me, and I was taken aback to find that my brother was not among them. This was quite surprising, as he had always been with them during their previous visits. Curious about their reasons for coming, I decided to engage in conversation with them. Initially, I assumed they would come to apologize for past issues, but after a little small talk and exchanging condolences, they got straight to the main point. They revealed that while my brother was in college, he had developed a drug habit, which was now impacting his ability to hold down a job. Their manner seemed to downplay the seriousness of the situation, but it was evident to me that he was in deep trouble and in desperate need of help. Following this revelation, they asked me to share my future inheritance with them, claiming it would aid in paying for a rehabilitation program for my brother. I was perplexed and inquired why he couldn't simply go to one of the low-cost rehabilitation programs that they could afford. They responded that they had tried those options, but they weren't suitable for him and that he needed a residential program, which they claimed was quite costly. I didn't have any personal experience with rehab facilities, nor was I familiar with their costs. What I knew was that I had been fortunate enough to secure a good job, providing me with a comfortable financial status. Additionally, I was aware that my grandmother was financially stable, having inherited a considerable amount from my grandfather. She had managed her investments wisely, which would benefit me but put my parents in a complicated situation since they had distanced themselves from her. Despite knowing that they might eventually need financial assistance, they had too much pride to reach out to her or even extend a proper apology toward the end of her life. I felt indifferent about their pride and told my parents I was willing to help, but with one crucial condition: they had to publicly acknowledge the wrongs they had committed in the past. I wanted them to recognize the terrible way they treated me, the hurtful things they had said, and their behavior toward my grandmother. I believed it was necessary for everyone to be aware of the truth, especially since we had kept our family issues under wraps for years at my grandmother's request, in order to avoid any drama. Now that they had approached me and audaciously asked for financial help to share my grandmother's money, I felt an obligation to ensure that they acknowledged their past actions. I didn't feel any remorse for this demand. In fact, I felt it was essential for my own peace of mind. When I laid out my condition, I noticed the shock on their faces as they reacted negatively. They attempted to negotiate, calling me unreasonable and selfish, but I stood firm. I explained that this was my requirement, and they could either accept it or walk away. I held no grudges against my brother, and I wanted to help. However, it was important for them to recognize their past mistakes to allow me to move on fully. There was no other way around it. They had not only treated me poorly but had also shown disrespect towards my grandmother. The money in question came from her, and if they wanted any of it, they needed to take responsibility for their actions. Their response to my conditions was unexpected. They began accusing me of being heartless and emotionless, stating they never expected such behavior from me. I clarified that given our lack of communication over the last 10 years, they shouldn't have anticipated anything from me. I reiterated that if they sought my assistance, it required them to confront their wrongdoings and apologize for them. That was my final stance, and I didn't want to engage in further debate on the matter. They ultimately left after a charged emotional exchange filled with tears and accusations, but I remained resolute in my decision. I firmly stood my ground, and now my family is trying to convince me to change my mind. They are insisting that my brother is in dire straits and desperately needs my support. However, I cannot comprehend why they expect me to drop everything for them when, throughout the years, I never anticipated receiving help from them. For as long as I can remember, my grandmother and I relied solely on each other. My family showed little to no interest in our lives, rarely bothering to check in on us. Even when my grandmother passed away, they likely wouldn't have known about her death unless I had informed my relatives. That's how they eventually learned about the funeral arrangements. So why should I feel compelled to assist individuals who have been absent from our lives for over a decade? I have made it clear that I will not provide any financial assistance unless they publicly acknowledge and accept their wrongdoings. I appreciate everyone who commented on my original post and expressed their concern. I am managing well, thank you for asking. Dealing with the loss of my grandmother has been challenging, but she lived a long life and passed without any regrets, which brings me some comfort. So, I genuinely thank everyone for their kindness and condolences. As for my parents, they continue to reach out online, but I've made it clear, if they don't follow through with what I've requested, they can forget about any possibility of inheriting money. My grandmother left everything to me in her will, and I know my parents are aware of this since the lawyer notified them via email. At this point, all they can do is stew in regret. It has been a week since our last conversation, and since none of their tactics have worked, they've resorted to sending me distressing pictures of my brother, who is in a sad state. They keep insisting that I should step up and help him. To that, I have only one response: where were they when I needed help? They abandoned me when I was in need, and I was fortunate that my grandmother supported me during those tough times. While I do feel sympathy for my brother, I refuse to assist them unless they genuinely apologize for their past actions. This apology must be made publicly. I want others to see the type of people they truly are. If they can set aside their egos, I might consider helping them. For me, this situation is about dismantling their pride, which has driven their previous actions. Now, I want to see what matters more to them, their son or their pride. 10 days have gone by since I last communicated with my parents, and I finally stopped replying to their messages. Yesterday, they showed up at my home unexpectedly, and this time, they brought my brother along with them. From the moment they arrived at my door, I made it clear that their actions were unacceptable. The way they approached the situation was only jeopardizing their chances of receiving any support from me. I could not bear the thought of my brother being used as a pawn in their scheme. I told them they needed to leave my home, and at first, they hesitated, insisting that I promised to help them if they left. I refused to give them any such promises. I warned them that if they continued to pressure me, I would call the police, which would only complicate matters for them given my brother's condition. The mention of the police seemed to scare them enough that they finally left, but my dad had the audacity to call both my grandmother and me the most selfish people on earth. This judgment is particularly ironic coming from them, considering they were the ones who abandoned me at my grandmother's doorstep. The reality of my upbringing has been shaped by the fact that my parents were unable and unwilling to accept me for who I really am. They couldn't cope with the challenges that came with having a child with special needs. Instead, they wished for a child who fit perfectly into their expectations, a perfect little boy who would meet their standards without complications. In their eyes, I was a disappointment because I wasn't that child. Their words, if they had even been formulated, would have described a level of selfishness that I can only imagine, considering how they treated both me and my grandmother in the situation. Fast forward a bit, and here I am with an update, although I haven't posted in nearly 2 months because life got busy with work. In that time, significant changes have taken place. I have moved into a new apartment in a different neighborhood, one that feels much better suited to my needs. As part of this transition, I have made sure that my parents have absolutely no way to reach me. They have been blocked from contacting me entirely. In addition, I have informed all my relatives that they are not to provide my new address to anyone, especially not to my parents. This precaution was essential, especially after a previous incident where someone thought it was appropriate for my parents to know where I live since they believed I was suffering. That led to them tracking me down, which I never want to experience again. After our last conversation, when my dad called me selfish, it became painfully clear to me that I couldn't continue this back and forth. I decided to block them, not wanting to engage in any more family drama. It was evident that their pride always took precedence over everything else, even over the love they professed to have for me as their son. I've come to terms with the truth that they never truly loved or accepted me because of my dyslexia and ADHD, along with various other challenges I faced. What confounds me further is how they treated my brother differently. My brother was always portrayed as their perfect child, someone they adored. It baffles me that they could not make even a small sacrifice for him, considering how much they claimed to love him. All they had to do was admit they had made a mistake, which wouldn't have been a heavy burden, given that most family members were already aware of the tension between us. Keeping things private was impossible, and yet they still refused to acknowledge any wrongdoing. In their minds, they believed they were flawless, and it was astonishing how stubborn they were in that belief. As for me, I've reached a point where I choose to keep my own beliefs and truths to myself. I've decided to focus on my own life and my inheritance, keeping it for myself as I see fit. It's a fair trade in my eyes.